thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming in out of the sunshine. It was the opposite yesterday. Uachtaráin, Hagin Ushla. We're very, very happy to be here. We're going to be talking about agriculture. And you might wonder, what has agriculture got to do with conservation? What's agriculture got to do with the environment? Well, actually, it's got everything, really, to do with the environment. And I thought I might kick off, first of all, by just introducing maybe ourselves very briefly. I'm an environmental writer. I used to write about politics, and I used to write about the arts. And I think one of the wonderful things we're seeing at this festival is that kind of intersectionality that, there's a tremendous... Every session I've been at with novelists, they've actually been talking about climate, which is very interesting, I think. So now I'm an environmental writer writing primarily about ecological restoration and looking at ways in which we can engage, which we must do, I think, a much, much broader public meaningfully with the detail and the broad strokes of the environmental crisis. Lisa and Hannah are both farmers and many other things also besides. So Lisa, maybe would you introduce yourself briefly?
Absolutely. So great to see so many of you here today. So my name is Lisa Fingleton, and I've been living down at Boreen in North Kerry for the last 2 years. So I can't quite explain my excitement at being here today and with real people, and just, I suppose, just to say the importance of that, of your contribution, because I think it's brilliant to have you all here today. So I lived on a small farm. I was trying to think, I've spent 35 years on farms in my life. Like, I've lived in big cities, I've lived in New York, I've lived in Paris. I started out on a farm in the Midlands, so Stradbally, only, not that far from here. And so my dad and mum would have had cattle and, cereal. And now I live on a certified organic farm 1 mile from the sea in Ballybunion. I suppose my work, I would have written this book a couple of years ago called The Local Food Project, because I kind of believed that if we focused on food and if we started growing and eating local food, that would solve the solution, that would solve the problem somewhat in terms of climate change. But over the years, I suppose I've become more panicked, thinking, no, we need more than that. So last year, we would have planted 10,000 trees on our land. We are very much focused more on biodiversity than we are on food production at the minute and letting meadows grow. But I think that's enough for now as an introduction. I'm also an artist. I don't know if we mentioned that, but
I didn't know.
Yeah, so I'm an artist.
And in fact, the Local Food Project is a work of art as well as a book.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm really interested to be here today to talk about that as artists. I know a lot of writers previously, today and yesterday, have talked about the feeling of overwhelm in terms of climate change and how do we address that. And I'm the Kerry Visual Artist in Residence, the first ever that appointed artist in residence in Kerry, and I've chosen to work specifically on climate and biodiversity. So it's great to have a break from the studio because it's heavy going.
Great.
So thanks.
You. Hannah, you also have done many things already in your life.
Yeah, including visited Lisa's beautiful farm, which has been a highlight in recent times. So I am lucky enough to have grown up on our family farm in County Limerick. We have about 70 acres and pedigree Hereford cattle, which are the fat red and white ones, if anyone's ever wondering. And I'm lucky in a sense that my grandmother's always run the farm. So it's a matriarchy, a bit like elephants or killer whales, depending on your take on that. So I was lucky or unlucky enough, I got onto a BBC traineeship a couple of years ago and was just dreadfully homesick instead of feeling dreadfully lucky. And I think in the Lake District, they talk about sheep being like hefted to the land. And it kind of brought home to me that I really felt hefted to our farm. So I worked for the BBC for over 3 years and did lots of stuff with them, was very lucky to do stuff with them. And then rang up the Farmers Journal and said, hello, I exist. I would like to come home to my own farm. Do you have any jobs for journalists? And luckily enough, they did. So I worked for the Farmers Journal for just under 4 years, and I've just moved on now and I'm working for RTE, usually in radio, along with running the farm with my grandmother, who is the real boss of the operation. So that's what I'm doing at the minute.
Great, thank you. So with that kind of introduction, I just wanted to kick off with a couple of quotes, some of them going back quite a long period, from writers that I think are relevant to what we're talking about. But the first one is a fairly new one from a wonderful book called Farming for Nature, which is written from a series of projects, but particularly the Burren program, which some of you may be familiar with, about agri-environmental schemes. But one line in it really, really struck me, that reversing the loss of European biodiversity is clearly dependent on the conservation of farmland. And that's kind of something that perhaps many environmentalists, at least until fairly recently, would never have thought about. You know, conservation was something you did generally off the farm in wild, so-called wild places. So I think that's interesting, the idea that, you know, recovering biodiversity is dependent on conservation of farmland. And then these are kind of more, if you like, philosophical, from Barry Lopez, wonderful, wonderful biologist and writer, wrote a book called Arctic Dreams, and in talking about how the Inuit peoples managed their lives in the very difficult conditions of the Arctic, he said that what he'd learned from them is that it is possible both to live wisely on the land and to live well. I think that's kind of an important thought to hold, maybe. And then from Bill Jordan, one of my heroes in ecological restoration, in his book called The Sunflower Forest, he talks about the important question of learning to live graciously on the planet. This is a problem that has challenged all peoples at all times. It's not new. And solving it is one of the perennial tasks of culture, not just of science, but of culture. And finally, Aldo Leopold, who's an American, one of the founding fathers, and they were, I'm afraid, mostly fathers, of American conservation in the 1940s, 1950s. He uses this phrase. He talks about our tools in the 20th century are better than we are. They grow faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom and command the tides. But they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history: how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And I think some of those quotes kind of go to the core of where, from knowing both of you, I think our conversations might go. But, I mean, maybe, Hannah, starting with you, what is the experience for you? Because I know we want to talk about gender today as well. What is your experience as a young woman working as a farmer and working in the media about agriculture? What's your life like?
I think I'm such a novelty that people find it really interesting, that I do get calls up sometimes being like, hello, we hear you're a woman and a farmer. Can you please give us a quote? And it's that weird thing as well, because the president of the National Farmers Union in England is a woman, a very well-spoken, eloquent woman. And when she was elected, one of the things she said was essentially that she wanted it to be the normality for women to be seen, you know, in roles in farming rather than just some sort of weird oddity that we get asked for a quote just because we're a woman. And that happens in other sectors as well, not just farming. So in some ways it's been great because obviously as a journalist you want to get as much coverage as possible, and there's that element to it. And then in another way I just want to normalize it because there are so many women out there working on farms every single day, but their role just isn't acknowledged. You know,
you gave me an incredible quote during the week, which is how many women own farms, and how many women contribute to...
Yeah, according to the last CSO statistics, only 12% of farmers in Ireland are women, and yet roughly a quarter of the work on farms would be done either partly or in the majority by women. So their role isn't recognised formally, and the transfer of land to women doesn't happen either, in that fewer than 500 women under the age of 35 are in receipt of farm grants. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. And I was saying this to the lads as well, that, you know, there is no genetic code out there that makes you better at turning on a washing machine or a milking machine. You know, they're the same buttons, essentially. They're not that difficult to use. And yet that transfer of ownership and that cultural bias is really, really hard to break through. And it's been something that's recognised. I don't know if people know, but the next Common Agricultural Policy is happening 2023 to 2027. Department of Agriculture are taking submissions on it now. And I'm working with a stakeholders group for women, and we're trying to get a submission in. But there are elements of it that are difficult difficult in just A, finding women who are willing to contribute, and B, getting us all to work together, and that's true of anything. But something that stood out to me was one woman said, well, we don't want to get the men's backs up. And I was just like, why not? Like, feck them at this stage of the game. We've been doing all the dog work for them. Why don't we actually get our names on the land? And there was another example as well, and I don't mind naming them, a very high up cooperative body called ICOS, which is essentially made up of representatives from various dairy processors. But not a single person on the board is female. And I remember going to an event where one of their board members was retiring and being honoured, and it was, a very nice event, and there were lots of pictures being taken, everything like that. But the man on stage handing over the Lifetime Achievement Award to the man who was retiring said, and sure, when you were up here in Dublin at the meetings, we knew that Mary back home was milking the cows. Ha, ha, ha. We knew who the real farmer was in the relationship. And I was just like, that's not funny. In any shape or form. Why don't you recognise that there is a problem here? So that's something I'm passionate about, and something that I would like to see change. Among environmental measures, the next Common Agricultural Policy, gender and environment are two things that I would be quite passionate about.
Lisa, how does that speak to your experience?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I suppose gender, as I was discussing with our president over lunch, gender itself is problematic. And I think, so I've kind of stayed out a lot of the gender debates at the minute because, we're trying to have more inclusive language. And, a lot of the times, I can't remember who was saying yesterday about, it was president was talking about, is it gendered, like that people, so men do certain things or women do certain things. And we were talking about, is it natural for farmers to be, more in tune with animals than others? But I think for me, I suppose it's a wider question of diversity. It's not just about gender. So we're two lesbians and we're referred to as the lesbians living down the lane. And then one farmer said his daughter came home from Australia with her Maori partner, and he was like, would you ever go down to the lesbians? Because they're now the lesbians on the hill and we're the lesbians down the lane. So I kind of rambled there at the beginning, sorry, but I was just trying to think about the wider questions. And, there's really interesting groups in America that are talking about, we're talking about Black Lives Matter, but the ownership of land by Black people, and land has been stolen so much from cultures from Native Americans across, America. And so all of those issues around diversity concern me as much as gender, that we've so little representation in terms of other groups, minority groups. And it's really interesting because I meet a lot of farmers in my work, but it is actually interesting. A lot of the women who have bought up land, who are doing the really interesting work about biodiversity, as well as men. But also I know loads of queer farmers across Ireland who are doing this incredible work down boreens and really been at the forefront of biodiversity, and they're absolutely invisible. And in my other day job, then I manage a project for women. And so many women that would come to us would be farmers' wives who have been absolutely invisible in the system. And are not getting pensions, even though they've been milking calves and raising calves and doing everything for years and raising families. So even though I started by saying I don't want to be talking about gender because it's problematic in itself, I'm very aware that there's huge issues. And it's like anything. This is a planetary crisis. That's the most important thing that I can think of to dedicate ourselves to. And the more diverse the voices at the table, the better our solutions will be. And as Hannah says, if we have boards that are only men, then we're not going to hear the voices of all the other people that matter. But we need to be broad in our definition of diversity and be inclusive of all different voices.
Okay, well, what I'm wondering is that if responding adequately to the climate and biodiversity crises does really depend, among other things, but very, very largely and importantly, on what we do on the land, within the farming community, how much do you think that message is now being understood? Or do you think that farmers still feel, or that many farmers still feel singled out as the enemy, and this kind of environmentalists versus farmers, which I think environmentalists have often contributed to, sometimes by the language they use, or their simple, total ignorance of what it is actually like to live on the land. But do you think that farmers are now seeing themselves perhaps less as exclusively producers of food and more perhaps as producers of biodiversity, which includes food? Yeah,
I guess there's two elements to that, in that I get I don't know if anyone out there is on Twitter, but sometimes the rows that erupt on Twitter between farmers and environmentalists are disappointing to me as a farmer, because I don't think we're going to get anywhere if we keep staying at loggerheads with each other all the time. And I would see myself, my role as a farmer is just important in terms of food production as it is as an environmentalist, and like looking after the farm and, you know, recognising the bird species. And we're really happy that kestrels have just come to the farm and they've fledged this year for the first time ever. And that's exciting to us because there's been, I think it's a 25% decline in kestrels in recent years and things like that. So that's really important to me to see. And I know that that's really important to a lot of other farmers out there. But what we need to talk about as well is, why are farmers so focused on producing food? And they're so focused on producing food because when the Common Agricultural Policy first came into being after World War II, we have to remember that rationing was still in place, that there was a shortage of food, and we needed as much cheap food as possible to feed this growing population. And now what we have is a situation where we have another crisis bigger than World War II. It's in that it's a global crisis, and it's affecting the climate and affecting the world. So we need to kind of pull up the handbrake and once again look at what the Common Agricultural Policy is doing. So 50 or 60 years ago, it was a common good in that it was producing food. And now it needs to be rethought of in that it's a common good, not just looking at food production, but also looking at environment and climate. But I think what you have to understand as well is that can be really, really scary, because the average age of a farmer is 56 or 57 years old. And if you're turning to usually a man who is 56 or 57 years old, and if you say, what you knew the whole time for your whole lifetime in this one career that you dedicated yourself to is going to change, and the method of how you're going to get paid is going to change, then obviously that's going to scare you. So it's a matter of kind of communication and working with people as well. But I just would beg people not to believe everything that they read on Twitter as well, because all those arguments are, you know, a storm in a teacup most of the time. And all the farmers that I meet, and I'm lucky enough to be a judge for Farming for Nature as well, they are so passionate about what they're doing. And it might sound strange, but in the 4 years that I worked with the Farmers Journal, I never met a farmer who was a climate denier. I just didn't. I went out to their farms and they were so proud of elements and pockets of their land that they had, that they were contributing to nature.
But I want to go to the local food project in a moment, but I'd just like to continue with that for a second, because I think you, on your Twitter account, you have a pinned tweet where you talk about a particular dilemma that is very, very typical to farmers and has to do with the silos in which the Department of Agriculture and the National Parks and Wildlife Service live and don't interact in any meaningful way, it seems to me, or very rarely. And you talk about we need to rethink the unit of productivity on the farm. Now, that's a bit technical. What does it mean in practice on your land? Because you show a photograph.
And Lisa and I would have talked about this a lot as well. And it goes back to so basically, at the minute, you get paid per hectare. The average amount you get paid per hectare is roughly around €230 for your basic payment plus. Anyway, I won't get into it. That's the average. So we would have roughly a 70-acre farm, but 8% of that farm is scrubland. And we were told to plough it and to plant it with coniferous trees. We were told to plough it and reseed it, but we never have, because we look at it as a wildland habitat, essentially. But we don't get paid any money because of that. And 8% of anyone's land or 8% of anyone's payment is a big chunk of your payment. So thinking about, rethinking the unit of production, that farms aren't just generating generating food anymore. They're generating biodiversity, they're generating clean air, they're generating clean water. And we're getting told by consumers and members of the public that that's what they want to see farmers doing. But then the Department of Agriculture and consumers and also, the powers that be in Brussels have to understand that the unit of production has to be rethought, that we're not just producing food, we're producing biodiversity. And it's only fair then that that's what we get paid for as well for doing that.
I think if you want to follow that up at all, there's a wonderful exchange at the Oireachtas Agricultural Committee a few years ago. If you Google Michael Daveran and the Oireachtas Agricultural Committee, he said, Michael Daveran also, he's a veteran, he wasn't born yesterday. and in many ways quite a traditional farmer. But he's been a pioneer of this Burren program, which is literally producing biodiversity. And they have this scheme where they are paid according to the species of plant that they have growing naturally. They don't plant them, but you get points for orchids, you get points for mountain avens, you get points for all sorts of different plants. And that is how your farm payment is partly calculated. And when he went to the Oireachtas committee, he said, all my life, I've been feeding up cattle, and when I bring my cattle to the market, I know I must bring the best possible cow to get the best possible price. And he said, what I've now realized is that to get paid for biodiversity, I've got to bring the best possible biodiversity to the nation for the benefit of the nation if I am to get paid for it. So we might come back to those schemes in a minute, but Lisa, I'd like you to maybe explain in some detail the local food project, because I think that kind of takes us from this phrase farm to fork that's used an awful lot. But what did you learn from this 30 days you spent trying to eat only local food and documenting it?
Brilliant. Can I just ask a question, though, because I think it's quite... Can I just ask the audience a question? Just a show of hands. How many people here grew up on farms? Oh, so not that many. How many people here live in the country? Quite a lot. And how many people grow their own food? Oh, okay, great. And how many people's grandparents grew food? Okay, so my point in asking these questions is, when you say the farmers, actually a third of this room grew up on farms. So in Ireland particularly, there is really no them and us, because I think we either grew up on a farm or we live next to a farm. We're not an urban country. So I was just curious about that. But it's great to see so many people growing local food. So the local food project started, I suppose we're on our farm in Kerry 15 years. And then I grew up in Laois, where my dad and my mom grew all our own food. I actually didn't know that people ate in restaurants, imagine, because everything was grown and all our clothes were made. My parents were super self-sufficient without the word even being known. And so then when I came back to farming, I suppose we had this very idyllic notion. We were running a bar in Cork and we thought, we'll go live on the land in Kerry. And the land was 5 generations of my partner's family. And as we were growing food, I was getting more and more concerned that people were so disconnected. I have a bottle over there that's an orange juice that says, it's a Blas na Héireann prize for an Irish food product, but they're oranges. And on the bottom of it says expertly squeezed in Carlow. And I thought, but my point is, we're actually looking at these labels, and obviously the producers of that, it's a really nice orange juice, but we're so disconnected from what is actually growing in our fields, and the labeling has all changed. So I was getting really concerned about this, and people were saying to me, but we want to support, but how do we know what's Irish and what do we know what's not? And then I bought a sandwich one night, and I was like, oh my good God, there's 45 ingredients in a BLT sandwich. And I thought, why isn't everybody up in arms about this? Why aren't people concerned? So I wrote a book then called The Local Food Project. And The Local Food Project was really just to encourage people to think about how we can... It's such a simple thing. There's a quote, a woman called Anna Lappe says that every euro you spend tells the world how you want it to be. And by you being here today, you're choosing to support culture and artists and writers. And by every single penny that we spend on food, we are either choosing to enhance, as the President said last night, rural families, keep them on farms, keep rural communities, or we're choosing to give money back to multinationals. Then I thought, I can't be a hypocrite and tell people, oh my God, you must eat local food. So I decided I would do it myself. If anyone is interested in this and you haven't heard of Barbara Kingsolver, I would definitely check out her book, Animal, Vegetables, Miracles. I see some of you nodding there. So she ate local food for a year. So I decided to do it for 30 days, just to eat Irish food. Now I'm talking about actual ingredients that come from farms for 30 days and nothing else. So that's all in the book. You can hear about it. It's pretty, it was intense. But it's really good because it brings up all those issues around labelling. And I suppose when we think about food, I was just thinking today, the chemicals that are going into our food and how they're all linked to, the wars and how those chemicals... Like if a plane flew over here today, now we've a president, so it would be really a crisis. But if a plane flew over here today and sprayed chemicals on all of us, how would we feel? We'd be absolutely, well, probably dead, but we'd also be enraged. And that biological warfare is going on all the time. And I'm sitting in my farm going, why are people not concerned about this? And even in the new CAP, I did all of the surveys this week in CAP. I responded to every single one of them. But all they asked was, should we give money to this person or this person? Should we look at gender equality or should we not? Not the big important questions like, should this island not be an organic island? Should we, like we have the rain, we have the soil, we have the knowledge. We talk about indigenous cultures from different parts of the world. We have indigenous farmers who've lived here all their lives and they know these rocks and these lands better than anybody else. And we're talking about displacing them and putting them in with new farmers. So anyway, look, I'm down at Boreen. I have loads of time to think about this. It's wrecked my head. So I shall be over with Paddy after if anyone wants to come and quiz us. But so the 30-day food challenge was really my response to try and see how difficult is it to support local farmers and eat local food. And I think there's a few people in the audience I know who tried it and they found it really difficult and really challenging because the labelling, like the expertly squeezed in Carlow, confuses people because they see Carlow and they think, great, there's oranges growing in Carlow, but there's not. I could go on all day.
Can I ask you then how you integrate your artistic crisis with your your artistic practice with your agricultural practice?
Yeah.
Is that a difficult relationship? I mean, you say you're glad to get out of the studio sometimes, but...
Just today, yeah, because glad to be here. Well, no, it's. Do you know what I find? I don't know if other people experience this, but I always had this... For the last couple of years, I felt I became more of a farmer and less of an artist. And then because of the climate crisis, I suppose, I really felt this draw to trees, and I love trees, and I felt it would be really important for us to plant trees. But in order to plant the trees, I had to take on a real job, and I love my real job, but I had to do that. So I really felt that my artistic practice was compromised, and then I wasn't an artist anymore because I was doing all this other work. But I have to say, I think she's here in the audience, Dr. Kathy Fitzgerald has developed a program called Haumea, Haumea, and it's an eco-literacy program, and she is absolutely amazing in terms of framing what I do as a farmer and an artist as both, so an eco-social artist. And I cannot tell you the relief that was, because I felt really sad about the fact that here I was trying to pay back this loan to plant trees and I wasn't able to spend so much time in the studio. So it has been a real... and then you're up at 6:30 in the morning feeding chickens, and then the mink at the chickens and kill the chickens, and then you're like, oh God, there's more money gone and the poor chickens are dead. So it's a constant, but I feel like I have made quite a number of films over the years that have really integrated the two, and books are a really nice way. Like, so I'm writing a new book and I'm drawing a new book, and books are great because they travel on their own and they have their own life and people can infuse them with their own imaginations. So I think I'm getting there. I should do Michael's on it, I'm failing miserably and it's all dreadful, but it's getting there. We were slagging over the idea of failure this morning. It's challenging. But it's possible.
Hannah, do you when you in your farming and in your journalism, what part does culture play? What part do the arts play? Do you feel that the realities of agricultural life perhaps aren't as reflected? I think a lot of our arts, I'm generalizing hugely here, but have very much in the last 20, 30 years focused on urban life. I mean, we have the John B. Keanes, we've lots of art that relates to agriculture in the countryside. But do you feel that it's something that could be done differently, or there could be more useful engagement between the agricultural sector and the cultural sector, if you like?
Farmers digging with pens. I don't know. I was thinking about this because I know that was the topic of our talk, and I was thinking about how agriculture shaped the land in kind of a larger scale. If we think about Newgrange even, and the importance of the seasons and our worship of the sun as well, and how important it was to growing crops and things like that. And I was talking to you guys I was thinking about the Lake District and the importance of the wool trade was to them, and how at the time that was sheep farmers were millionaires. Who knew it? But back then they were, because of the wool, and that helped to fund and investment in these huge cathedrals and new forms of architecture and design and everything like that. But I do think culture and farming are important in a lot of ways, just because it connects us with the soil and with life in a very raw way that we've insulated ourselves from. Even the things as simple as like seeing a calf being born and things like that. I worry that even though, we talk about, how many farmers are in the audience or grew up on farms and things like that, that we have taken a step back. And I was really interested as well in the response to organic food, and it's something that I've been looking at quite intensely because I'm interested in it because people say they want more organic food and they're really interested in organics. And yet I'm really disappointed then in the response from consumers in a lot of ways, because if you take organic lamb, for instance, 3 out of every 4 organic lambs that are raised organically actually go into the commercial system because there isn't enough demand and consumers aren't willing to pay a higher price for organic lamb. And that's really, really sad. And the same with organic beef as well. There's roughly about 1,500 organic beef farmers out there, and the next Common Agricultural Policy, they don't want any more organic beef farmers because they think they've reached the limit of it. It's going to be organic dairy and organic tillage that they're going to be aiming to incentivize and get more of them on board. But even when you look at organic dairy farmers, there's roughly 62 in the country. It's something that I would ask you when you go home and when you're shopping, that you don't realize how powerful you are as consumers going out, and even how powerful we are, and that picking up food and actually looking at where it comes from, not just squeezed in Carlo, but where it was grown. Because even your vegetables, and I'm always trying to buy organic vegetables, yet we import 70% of the organic vegetables that we need, and that's ridiculous. That is, we import more potatoes than we grow. That's ridiculous. What are we doing? So it's kind of hard questions that definitely, I have no problem being asked hard questions as a farmer of where I'm going and where I'm going in the future. But I think as consumers, people need to go home and they need to ask themselves some hard questions too about what they're buying and what they're putting in their shopping trolleys.
Can I just come in there on that? And is it 1% of our farms grow vegetables? We think, that's why I asked you about did you grow food, because we're the lowest in Europe in terms of growing our own food, and that's really in 1 or 2 generations, because in the past we would have had a little garden with food growing in it, and I think it's 2% of our farms are organic. It's a tiny percentage.
Yeah, 2% of our farms are organic. The target for Brussels for 2027 is to reach 25%. 25% of the farms to be organic. So basically we would have to go from 177,000 acres to 860,000 acres by 2030. That's not really going to happen, and the Irish government knows that, which is why the target that they've set is to go from 2% to 7.5% by 2030.
And I should also say, in terms of, you were asking about, farmers and farmers' interest in climate. Last year, we applied for the organic farming scheme, as did many other farmers. 75% of the people who applied for the organic farming scheme were refused. And everyone who had to apply had to do a Teagasc organic farming course for 4 days. And they cancelled it in Munster, so we all had to travel to Portlaoise in order to apply for the organic farming scheme. And then they refused the 75%.
And why were people turned down?
Oh, well, it was in favour of, there's a huge big politic around, dairy, and was it dairy or beef?
It is because essentially they feel like there isn't the consumer demand there for organic beef, but they know the consumer demand there is for more organic dairy, so they are trying to get more organic dairy farmers in.
And even in a context where we only have 2% of our farms growing vegetables, so the rules, I suppose that's the thing. But
then again, that has been completely market-led rather than trying to change the market as well, which might help.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily market-led. Market will always follow what they're told to do, and there's absolutely no advertising in Ireland on organic food. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I've ever seen an ad on radio or television advertising organic food. So people will follow, that's just how we are. We follow,
And yet, if you listen to the ads put out by the Department of Agriculture and indeed by Board BIA and the Origin Green ads and the films, you'd almost get the impression that it was all organic and that it was all small family farms. And I think this is a huge contradiction, that we're projecting one image nationally and internationally of farming, but the reality of farming, of the people who are actually making money from farming, which are very few people, relatively speaking, That's not at all the type of farming they're doing, the type of intensive farming they're doing.
Yeah. Like, I suppose ideally what needs to happen is we're talking about system change, not climate change. And really the system has to change, because at the moment the pressure is all on us organic farmers to tell exactly what seeds we're planting, write down oceans of paperwork, whereas nothing is asked of the farmer who is, literally, I could spray a bowl of food with acid and I could hand it to you, and I do not have to tell you, because of the rules of the lobbying in Brussels, I don't have to tell you that that was sprayed, because I don't have to list the processes that were involved in the food that I gave you, and you can check that out because it's true. So we can do anything to the food and not have to label that we've put poison on it. I was at the ploughing championship during the 30-day food challenge, and there was a farmer with barley, and I reached in to taste it, because I was actually hungry, and I thought, how desperate to be eating barley. And he hit my hand and he said, do you not know that's sprayed with acid? And I said, no, I didn't know it was sprayed with acid. So all these processes are happening behind the scenes. And because of very, very careful lobbying, we're not being told. And therefore, all the pressure is on the organic system to say what they're doing, but the others are being left off. And we're not finding it. Yes, we're being told, okay, now it's produced in Spain or it's been produced everywhere. But there's a really good book by Joanna Blythman called Swallow This. And she really is clear about the processes and the poisons that are being put into our food. Like the sprays, I said, if it was coming out of the air, we'd all be up in arms saying, why are you spraying me? But we're not up in arms when we're spraying all of the bees and all of the butterflies. They fly from our lovely meadows and they go next door, not in so much in North Kerry, but, you know, in different places, and they just dead like that because of all this.
Okay, I want to kind of move towards questions but maybe slightly on a note of hope, because I think it is important to acknowledge that there are schemes like the Burren programme, which have extended now around the country. And the real difference with these programmes is that they are based on results. Farmers are being asked to produce biodiversity. And it's a revolutionary idea. So instead of the old agri-environmental schemes were all about telling farmers not to do things or actions they had to carry out, these programs actually say, we want to see an increase in biodiversity or water quality or some other manifestation of environmental health on your land. But you can decide as a farmer, because you know your land best, how you achieve that within certain obvious limits. And these schemes are really successful, and farmers are queuing up to join them. The big problem so far, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think the answer is slowly developing, is that all of these schemes are based on small, marginal farmers. And so the real dynamo at the heart of our agriculture is kind of untouched by them. And I think until we can find a way to build those kind of schemes into the practices of intensive farming, making it obviously less intensive, I don't think we can get rid of it altogether, or certainly not in a heartbeat. But I think that if we can start to reward big intensive farmers for producing biodiversity as well as producing food, but we've got to pay for that. We as taxpayers have got to be prepared to pay for that. We have got to be prepared to pay for ecosystem services and pay for the people who make those services flow better and more healthily. I'd like now to move. We've, I think, about 10 minutes for questions. 15, good. Somebody just down there.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. Just looking at Hannah working, the reality is the big elephant in the room when you talk agriculture is income. We are arable farmers. We've had the same price for grain for 30 to 40 years, right? Beef is not much different. The CAP was designed 40 years ago. That hasn't had a budget increase for 40 years. So everyone criticizes farming all the time, but the fact is most farmers have an off-farm job because they can't, like you do, Anna. Could you live on your farm income as it was without having a job? The majority of farmers, you talk about gender equality, most farmers have a working wife. She is subsidizing agriculture every day of her life. So I'm less concerned about, and like biodiversity is all of these things are very important, but at the moment agriculture is dying on its feet because nobody can afford to farm. And the ones who are surviving as farmers are being pushed into further intensification. All the dairy guys, they're ripping out hedges left, right, and you're thinking, for dairy, why do that? It's all, and they spray grass in the minute that they sow the seed because it's all about intensification, which is horrible. And that's what the agriculture policy is pushing them into because farming is a business. So please not forget farming is a business. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess and I totally hear you, and it's very difficult to keep lots of things in your mind when you're also being essentially asked to produce food and trying to make an income that's just about scraping by. And you're totally right. If we didn't have I would say that the grants we receive are roughly half of the overall farm income, and I've no problem admitting that. I'm a suckler farmer. I think the Teagasc average income for suckler farmers was €9,000 in 2020. I think for tillage farmers it was at 36,000. You roughly went down 1%, I think. And I don't totally agree with Lisa on the pesticides as well, because I know for arable farmers that you literally have to have them locked and sealed away, and for sprayers you have to have the number of your sprayer on it and everything like that. So there are tight regulations around that. But yeah, it's difficult, and I probably don't have the answer for you. But I would like to think that people are trying to find the answer, and I think it's also that you have to try and find it within your own farm gate as well. So I'm looking at diversifying and potentially going into poultry or something like that. But I've also gone into the National Parks and Wildlife Scheme, and we're planning on building some ponds and doing some stuff like that. But I'm being incentivized to do that, and I'm being paid to do that. But that only has a place for 300 farmers, and usually only has a place for 100 farmers every year. But you're right, but I don't share your hopelessness for the future. And maybe that's all I have is hope, but I am hopeful for the future, and I do think that things will change, and I think people want things to change. Farmers as well want things to change.
And I suppose you said there about you don't necessarily want industrial farming to change. I absolutely do want industrial farming to change. I think it's not good for the planet. 30% of the food that is produced...
I'm just saying it can't change overnight.
Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were saying you don't want it to change at all.
No,
I said, Paddy, I disagree with you. We can't have that at all going out. But when we look at food production, like 30% of the food that is produced is wasted. It goes straight into the bin. So when big companies tell us that we need more industrial farming, we don't. We really don't. Like 30% is going into the bin in the first place. So, I think we need to look at more diversity, because you're dead right. I mean, I'm from Stradbally, and all of the ditches went. And now the farmers that are coming down the lanes are bursting all the pipes because the tractors are too big. The young farmers are in debt for millions because they bought all these big tractors. It is, it's who's winning in this situation. And they always say, follow the money.
Super. Thanks very much for the interesting presentation. This question's mainly for Hannah. I definitely agree with you in that any farmers I'd speak with, and relatives included, would definitely not fall down as climate deniers or against climate change or anything like that. But could you speak a little bit more about the role in particular, say, the farmer organisations and as well the Irish Farmers Journal actually play in this debate too? I know they often publish suspect at best material on biogenic methane, which can sometimes, well, let's not call it climate denial, but climate delay at this stage is just as good as climate deny. And I know recently RTE came under a lot of heat about their policy on climate, which they've since improved as a result. But if we're to see farmers as climate activists, what do these organisations such as the IFA and Irish Farmers Journal need to change about their messages to the farmers?
Thank you, Hannah.
Wow, if I was still working for the Farmers Journal, I'd say you're trying to get me fired. Yeah, there is a big argument within the agricultural industry and within the sector in general in terms of what quantifies biogenic methane, and if biogenic methane is actually a real word. So basically, in Ireland, we probably know agriculture is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and about 34%, 35% according to the EPA, and that is largely made up of methane, which comes from the burping and the farting of cows. And if you are a dairy cow, you are guilty of more burping and farting because you are being fed meal, basically, nuts, dairy nuts, things like that. So yes, all of the farming media, not just the Farmers Journal, has a massive role to play in communicating, I would say, to farmers the message, and maybe a positive message, not always a negative message, and also the farm organisations as well. But once again, it is very difficult for them, and they are walking a very tight line, because going back to my original point, the bulk of farmers paying those fees to them are the 56 and 57-year-old, usually men, who are very scared of losing their income and very, very scared of change, as I think anyone in that position of being 56 or 57 would be. So they're walking a very tight line.
I suggest that sustainability requires the next generation to be able to take over a farm. If education of the people to eat properly, to learn how to grow their own vegetables, it's completely not on any agenda for schools and young people. We need to get the next generation growing their own food and, being acknowledging of the production of food. It is also highly important that we recognize that getting avocados in from Peru, putting them in a plane or in a slow boat, is burning the planet. Look at what you put into your shopping trolleys and stop, eating like a French person, or stop eating foods that come in from all over the world. And I think farmers, and I'm one of them, farming is the solution. We can be the solution to the problem, not be the blamed minority of our beautiful land.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, and I'm glad you brought in the global aspect to this, because you're absolutely right, and that, the Amazon has been burned down so we can produce more beef, and more avocados. And I think the President touched on it last night. There's you said 82 million, the last time I checked it was 65, but 80 million people are displaced already around the world. And we know what's coming. We know people are going to be displaced. You were asking the question about what should the farmers' organisation be doing. We should be creating a vision for what we want. And I'm sorry today because I focused a little bit on the negative, but we should be thinking about what kind of a country do we want? We could have Vandana Shiva. If you haven't seen her work, look up her work. They've created an organic state in India. So now you walk into that land and it's all wild flowers, it's meadows, it's organic food. It's not about producing food on a mass scale. Their tourism has gone up. The farm income went up, she says, 10 times. You can check it out. So we need to be thinking about what is our vision. I see Darina Allen here, look at the vision in Ballymaloe. Look at the vision. When nobody was talking about this stuff, they went ahead, they produced organic food, and look at the business model that's there now. And I was talking to somebody who said they went on a biodiversity walk. They're always evolving, they're changing. We could transform rural Ireland. Look at the Abbey Leaks Brog project in Laois. Yeah. Do you know? Yeah. Where a bog, North Kerry's filled with bogs and everyone's cutting the turf and there's war. We could be regenerating our communities if we stop talking about what we're getting. The word entitlements drives me mad in terms of CAP, our entitlements. So vision, what's our vision?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In Abbey Leash Bog, Google it if you don't know it, because it is an exemplary...
Go for a walk on the way home, it's gorgeous.
Absolutely. There was one more person wanted a question there.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much for the really interesting talk. I've been organic since 1994, and it was interesting what you said earlier about changing slightly from food production to sort of biodiversity, and I'm definitely gone that way. I'm going to say something which is a bit sad. I love this talk, but we do talk about it, and we really do need the support. All of what's been said about how the Farmers Journal, for example, or whoever it is, they have such an important role to reassure fearful farmers who don't know what it is that they're being asked to do. And we don't have a lot of time, really. So I wish we were having this conversation even 10 years ago. But I think we can move forward. But so really, it's not a question, but just a comment. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it is, I find that's when I was saying about the studio being hard, because I'm on my own in my room and I'm worrying about this. And I think we can be really sad. But I went to a climate conference in Findhorn, again, a wonderful place to go to nourish your soul in the north of Scotland. And there were lots of different, 350 people around the world talking about climate. And they said the despair is the privilege of the privileged. We do not have the time or the privilege of being despairing on this. And that is a real challenge to us. We talked about white privilege last night. We are so privileged in Ireland. You know, we have so much. So we don't have the privilege of despair, but we need to find ways to keep our energy up and keep our hearts okay so that we can deal with the eco-anxiety, because that's what it is. We have ash trees that I thought were immune to dieback, and the limbs, they're not even, the leaves aren't even going, it's the limbs are falling off the trees, and I can't even describe, I want to cry. Do you know, that these beautiful trees, what did we do? Importing crap, you know? Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay, your take-home message?
My take-home message is that we are all the change. And if you could just leave here today, don't do what you think you should do, but do what brings you joy. So if you are loving trees, plant trees. If you love to write, but use the energy and the power and really check in with yourself. What is it that I can do to help the climate? Last night, Mark O'Connell said, oh, writing is, nothing, it's nothing. Writing is everything. If it's your passion and if it's your gift. If you feel like I want to plant marigolds, I have marigold seeds for everybody in the audience, by the way. So that's it. Do it with your passion and do it with the biggest amount of, like Carol's going to be singing tonight, playing music. Just do what you do and do it for the planet, because there's nothing else that is more important. I could stay here all day.
I don't know how I'm meant to follow that one. I was thinking, because we were inside earlier and there was a big loaf of brown bread on the table, and not one speck of flour in that brown bread came from Ireland. I can guarantee you of that. So this is actually my take-home message, in that you as the consumer are more powerful than you realise. And please, when you are going shopping, don't just look at the label and say, expertly squeezed in Carlo. Please actually make sure that the product actually comes from Ireland. And in terms of organic produce as well, in terms of your vegetables, if you have a local farm shop or something like that, if those are the farmers that you want to see surviving into the future and your children shopping in, then you need to support them now, because like that man said down there, we don't have a lot of time. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you all very much again for your time and your kind attention, as Leonard Cohen used to say.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.